Let's break this down for you. Dr. Robert Edwin Kelly, political analyst, is now joining us from South Korea. In just a bit, we'll also be joined in by Dr. Graham Ong, research fellow from Singapore. Coming to you first, what do you make of this proposition that North Korea had given, a promise of peace? Is this a breakthrough in the first place? They have promised this in the past as well. It's not the first time. They've done this in 1994. They promised a similar peace sentiments in 2005 as well. Do you view this offer this time around with optimism?
Some. I mean, I hate to sound sort of dour about it. I mean, hope springs eternal, but just like you said, I mean, the North Koreans have sort of been here before and things have sort of collapsed. I mean, the real acid test for this, what really matters is sort of not the meetings and the Olympics and the mixed musical troops and the rest of it. What really matters is if the North Koreans make some kind of meaningful concession on something, right? And this has always been the problem, is that the North Koreans sort of give us sort of these nice, fine words about denuclearization. They've said this before, but that they don't actually follow through. So we have to be skeptical, but we should always try, right? I mean, we're now in a much better position than we were 6 months ago when Donald Trump was talking about bombing North Korea. I mean, at least the two Koreas are talking, so that in itself is progress of a sort.
They're certainly talking. There's certainly a thaw that seems to be emerging. But let's also take a look at what the United States is doing in the midst of this inching closer towards a peace process, if at all. The United States has imposed a fresh set of sanctions and has threatened to impose further sanctions in the wake of North Korea's involvement in the killing of the half-brother of Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-nam, using a chemical nerve agent. The United States, Heather Nauert, has said that this is the involvement of North Korea in the use of chemical weapons. Is this not a United States spoiler in the thaw that we see emerging between the two Koreas?
Yeah, that's actually a really good interpretation. To be honest, it's probably true. Yeah, it's not really clear. I mean, there's certainly been a lot of interest in how Kim Jong-nam died, and there was almost certainly a bureaucratic process that led to the finding that was released. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the timing of the release is pretty inappropriate. I mean, look, I think the Americans are really wary of this, right? I mean, it's pretty clear that the South Korean president and the American president are very different. Ideologically, they're very different. Stylistically, they're very different. Donald Trump really raised the temperature last year. We're on the verge of war back around Christmas time. You know, the Americans want to keep the South Koreans' feet to the fire, you know, not just the North, but the South, because if the South is going to deal with North Korea, what they really don't want, the Americans don't want, is for South Korea to go up there and make major concessions to North Korea in exchange for something that's genuinely cosmetic. Right? I mean, the United States government, rightly or wrongly, strongly believes that North Korea with a nuclear weapon is an intolerable threat to the United States. That may not be true, but the American government believes it, and they're just not going to let Moon go up there and make a trade. And so they're going to keep on pushing the sanctions until Moon comes back, the South Korean president, comes back with a really genuine offer from the North Koreans, not something they can slip out of, but something real.
What's also an intolerable threat, Dr. Kelly, taking a cue from what you're saying, is the trade that we see happening here in exchange for peace or in exchange for denuclearization. North Korea wants regime stability. Is that not a dangerous exchange that we are seeing? On one hand, denuclearization. On the other hand, we have North Koreans being oppressed by a dictator permanently.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it, actually, too, and that's often really not discussed in the media. It probably should be. That's an excellent question. Yeah, I mean, what the North Koreans want more than anything else is some kind of guarantee, some kind of ironclad guarantee the United States will not attack them. And the real problem here is that the United States has made these sorts of guarantees before, most importantly to Libya. We told Muammar Gaddafi if he gave up his nuclear weapons, we wouldn't attack him, and then 7 years later we did. And this is really the problem. This is why the North Koreans have traditionally been very skeptical of American promises. This has been one of the big problems in negotiations for the last decade. And I think I wonder what will satisfy the North Koreans. What will convince the North Koreans that America is not going to change its tune? Because once the North Koreans give up their weapons, then the Americans could strike, right? Which means the North Koreans aren't going to give them up unless they get something really, really dramatic, like the departure of American forces from South Korea. And I just don't know if Moon Jae-in can sell that to the United States, to conservative South Koreans. I don't know if we can get that by the South Korean conservative media. You know, maybe, but the North Koreans are not going to give up the nukes unless they get something really, really large.
All right, hold that thought there, Dr. Kelly. Also bringing in, as promised earlier, Dr. Graham Ong, a research fellow who's joining us from Singapore. Good evening. Appreciate you joining us on the broadcast. I don't know to what extent you've been listening in to the points made by Dr. Kelly, but the certain level of optimism or the lack of it when it comes to the latest proposition of denuclearization by North Korea. They've done this in the past twice, 1994, 2005. Do you share the optimism that the rest of the experts have been talking about on that front, that North Korea will perhaps walk its talk this time?
No, I don't share that optimism. I'm cautiously optimistic in the least, but I think more cautious nevertheless. I think we have to hark back to events of just a few months ago to remind ourselves that until the 28th of November, about 3 months ago, the North Koreans under Kim Jong-un were furiously testing their missile systems. I mean, we're talking about 89 tests to date, particularly under Kim Jong-un's watch, and of course 4 nuclear tests under his charge. And so a massive amount of investment in terms of research and development in fielding a operational and credible nuclear deterrent has been carried out. And so the question now becomes, what is the grand design behind the current spate of overtures in trying to produce a rapprochement with the South Koreans and in trying to forge a peace deal of sorts? So I mean, these questions lead me to just be cautious, and I think I would urge observers, and I'm sure many of them would concur, to be conservative in our outlook in terms of what to expect in the following discussions in April and following from that. Things could very easily slip back from some of the dividends we've achieved, what little dividends we've achieved over the last few weeks. And so that, of course, will require all stakeholders working together. The Americans in particular are a critical factor in how things will go forward, positively or negatively.
Dr. Graham, you are talking about a larger design on part of North Korea behind these overtures. One part, of course, is splitting the Seoul and Washington alliance, at least vis-a-vis the U.S. forces on South Korean soil. But the other rather dangerous component, perhaps, of that design is the choice that North Korea has put forth between denuclearization and a stable regime, which, in other words, translates into a permanent rule by North Korea's Kim Jong-un, dictatorial rule, to say the least, over oppressed North Koreans permanently. In a sense, we're talking about peace in exchange for that oppression to continue for the longest time.
Sure, certainly. I think you've hit a crucial nail, which is, of course, regime stability. And, what's happened over the course of recent times is, of course, the imperative for Kim Jong-un, for the government in Pyongyang, to secure Kim Jong-un's rule. I mean, so the saber rattling and the overtures we've heard from the Americans under the Trump administration have created, have heightened insecurity in the part of the government in Pyongyang. And therefore leading to a reaction of sorts where we've seen, reciprocations in return in terms of military overtures and whatnot. So, yes, the regime stability is extremely important. I don't think that the Trump administration, if I can second guess it, has any higher expectations about democracy manifesting in North Korea's political system anytime soon. I think it's not about the perpetuity of Kim Jong-un's rule, so to speak, but rather the manner of his conduct, which has created destabilizing outcomes over the last few months. I think if North Korea can demonstrate that it is not going to escalate and to sort of play the game of brinkmanship, I'm very certain that the American side and other stakeholders will also ratchet down. But nevertheless, clearly, regime stability is non-negotiable for the Kim Jong-un government, for sure. They want to secure that, and of course, the current nuclear deterrent that is being fielded by North Korea is designed to secure that regime.
Regime stability is non-negotiable. Dr. Kelly, would you like to come in here? And this, of course, takes us back to the earlier point that we were making. On one hand, Kim Jong-un tries to portray himself as, tries to portray his might, his power. But on the other hand, does this offer not smell yet again of Kim Jong-un's insecurity?
Yeah, I don't really disagree with anything that your previous guest had said. I think regime security is at the very top of the list. It's important to differentiate between regime security and national security in the North Korean case. That is to say that the regime, about the 100,000 people or so who run North Korea, they don't care at all about the people they rule, right? I mean, we know this. They have 2 million of them starved 20 years ago. And this puts us on the outside in the awkward position of caring more about the North Korean people than the North Korean's own government. And this gives the North Koreans a certain edge, a certain leverage in the debates, because there's just some things we will not do. I mean, we could starve the North Korean state into collapse, but we won't do that because the North Korean people would suffer first. And this comes to your point that, right, if we sort of draw some kind of final peace deal with the North Korean state, the people who are going to carry the costs are actually the North Korean population. I mean, this is always sort of lurking in the background, right? But this kind of humanitarian concern has been pushed out of the way, I think, in the last year and a half or two, because the nuclear issue has just become so large. I mean, the Americans are now genuinely concerned the North Koreans are going to strike the United States, which I think is inaccurate, but that's the fear that's driving the U.S. end of the debate.
That's the fear that's driving the debate, certainly. We're going to leave it there for the moment. Dr. Graham Ong and Dr. Robert Kelly, appreciate very much for joining us on the broadcast with those perspectives. Several finer aspects will, of course, be discussed in our later editions over the next few days as well.